Bibles and turn to the book of Acts, chapter 18. I'll begin reading in verse 1 and read through verse 17. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him in protest, he shook the dust off from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you. No one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." He stayed there for a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. We've been following the journeys of the Apostle Paul, missionary journeys, where he moved from Asia Minor over to Macedonia and then to down and further into Greece, last week in Athens, and today we come to the city of Corinth. And if we could have the map up just for a moment. I forgot to bring my pointer, but I'll use my finger. Corinth is right here. He just came from Athens over to Corinth. It's in the southern part of Greece. And, Corinth was really different from the other cities that Paul had visited, yet they were receptive to the gospel, somewhat. There are 3 words to help us remember Corinth, and each word begins with a C, so it'll help us when you think of the city of Corinth. The first is the word cosmopolitan. The city of Corinth was a mixture of people and races. Philippi was almost entirely Roman. Paul went to Philippi on a cross from Asia Minor to Philippi, and it was, as we saw, it was settled mostly by retired Roman soldiers. So it was pretty much Roman. And then there was Athens, which was a center of intellectuals. They would all gather there. Philosophers that talk about the newest idea. But the other cities that Paul had visited tended to be homogeneous in their makeup. But people came to Corinth from all over the Roman Empire. So cosmopolitan. Secondly, it was a commercial city. It was situated on the narrow isthmus, as we saw on the map there, that separated really northern Greece and southern Greece. And traffic really crossed north to south and east to west. So it was very commercial. You had goods going all directions, from all four directions. The third word is corrupt. In fact, the name Corinthian became synonymous with the most perverted behavior. Corinth was the center of the cult of the love goddess Aphrodite, and the Roman name Venus, but the Greek goddess Aphrodite. The temple of Aphrodite in Corinth was actually one of the wonders, the great wonders of the ancient world. And at one time had 10,000 temple prostitutes. In fact, if you were called a Corinthian, but you weren't actually from Corinth, it would be considered an insult to be called that. The name was so synonymous with the corrupt moral degeneration of Corinth that to be called a Corinthian was the height of insult. Now, I've entitled this message Encouragement from God because I believe Paul was experiencing some discouragement when he came to Corinth. If you think about his first two missionary journeys, and maybe we could put the map back up for a moment, Leslie. You know, when Paul began his first missionary journey, he and Silas went over through Cyprus, and we really don't, there's no evidence of any persecution of Paul and Barnabas in Cyprus. But then they went up to Antioch, and he was opposed so severely there that he had to leave town. And then he went to Iconium, and the same thing happened. So he went to Lystra. And at Lystra, those same forces came down to Lystra, and he was actually almost stoned to death. Stoning was a form of punishment. I mean, it was an execution. And he was really left for dead at Lystra. But survived that. On his second missionary journey, he goes across, visits those churches, and goes up to Philippi. And we recall what happened to Philippi. He's severely beaten. He's flogged by the authorities and thrown in prison. When he leaves Philippi, he goes to Thessalonica. And the Jews of Thessalonica kicked him out of town. Then he goes to Berea. And the same thing happens. The Jews from Thessalonica came down to Berea. And then he goes to Athens, and as we saw last week, really there were kind of meager results in Athens. If we're honest about it, the Word tells us there weren't many believers there that came to the Lord as a result of Paul's time in Athens. He must have been discouraged. And then he comes to Corinth, and he's all alone. Remember, he left Silas and Timothy up in Macedonia. And then there's the lack of funds we discover in this chapter. That he worked with Aquila and Priscilla, making tents. He was a tent maker by trade. In fact, you know, we use that term today when we talk about people who are, particularly when it comes to church planting, if they go off to plant the church, but there really isn't the funds to support that church planter full time, he has to get a part-time job. We refer to him as a tent maker. It means he's working a job besides trying to get the church started. And I did that for a while back in the St. Louis area. I drove a school bus for a while we were trying to get a church up and running. Tent maker. And so Paul was supporting himself, trying to get something going here in Corinth. In fact, it says in 2 Corinthians, when Paul wrote his second letter back to this church, he says he was kept from being a burden to them only by the supplies that eventually were sent by the Christians in Macedonia. The churches up there in Philippi and Thessalonica sent funds down to help him out while he was there. Then there, of course, there's the rejection at the synagogue right here in Corinth. It was always his custom to go to the synagogue first and proclaim the message, and his message was that, the Messiah that we're looking for has come, and it's Jesus. That was his message, but he was rejected. Again, we see here they opposed and reviled him, and so he shook the dust off his clothes as a sort of symbolic gesture of saying, I'm done with you. You've heard the message, your blood is on your head, not mine, because I've told you the message. So now I'm going to the Gentiles. So all of these things, rejection, abuse by the Jews, he was discouraged. I mean, I have to hand it to the Apostle Paul for his tenaciousness, because, most of us would say, I just don't need this anymore. I mean, how much does a person have to put up with? It's just not worth it. I've been stoned. I've been flogged, thrown in prison, verbally abused. I don't have to take this. I'm finished with it, and quit. But he didn't. But he had to be discouraged. And really, it was at this time, when he's most discouraged, that God intervenes in several important ways. He gets encouragement from God himself. And we see it. The first thing God did was he sent Silas and Timothy back to Paul. Remember, they had been in Macedonia, and it says, verse 5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word. But you can imagine, he was so glad to see some friendly faces again, and people he had worked with, his fellow workers. It had to be an encouragement. We think sometimes that we can carry on alone, but we can't, and we weren't meant to be. Ministry is a partnership of fellow believers working together. We need one another. And that's one reason, I think, why God has given the church, and why he has established a plurality of leadership in the church. Because it's a team effort. It's meant to be a team effort. Work together. Even Jesus, when he sent the disciples out, he sent them out 2 by 2 to take the message. We need that. We need the encouragement from one another. And God knew that Paul needed help. And I want to, in terms of just application, to say how important it is for us to encourage one another in ministry. And we're all involved in some way or another. And oftentimes, it's like what I see is kind of more public, and people see it. But there are a lot of you here that you are in ministry all week in different places, and nobody sees it. Nobody knows that. And it's hard to get encouragement. And sometimes it's good to share with others what's going on in your lives and how you're ministering, so that you can get that encouragement. It's good to encourage one another. If you see somebody they're doing stuff during the week, encourage them. They need that. We all need it. The second thing God did here in encouraging Paul was to help him financially. And he did that through the churches at Macedonia. Paul says again in 2 Corinthians, the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. Boy, and if you read 2 Corinthians, Paul really commends those churches in Macedonia. They came through when he was in a tough spot. He was discouraged. He had to work part-time to get things going there at the church, and they came through. And their financial help released Paul to be able to spend his time doing what God called him to do. And that's a difficult thing for people, and for example, for church planters. If they have to be tied up working part-time, they can't be putting the effort into what God has called them to do in starting a new church. And it just takes longer and longer. And oftentimes, those churches have a hard time succeeding because they just kind of limp along. And so this freed up Paul to really focus on what God had called him to do. Third thing God did to encourage Paul